Chapter 11. Ripley slipped her feet into a pair of boots and yawned widely. She felt grainy and exhausted, hung over from sleep. She knew that it would eventually wear off once she got moving, but that didn't stop her from a vague, wistful feeling as she looked around at the slumbering crew members. There were times when just staying asleep seemed infinitely better than getting up. She sighed, stood, stretched her arms over her head, then bent to touch her toes. A half-remembered line occurred to her as she flexed her arms, something about an early bird getting the jump on the others. The air cyclers had kicked on as scheduled, a low mechanical hum in the quiet sleep area. But the room was still cold enough for her breath to show. It would be warmer by the time the others got up. Apparently early birds were hot-blooded creatures. Her sleep had been deep and dreamless, and she had awakened, though not refreshed, at least ready to get on with things. Her general plan to get the Queen to Earth was okay, if perhaps not altogether reasonable. The specifics were still hazy, like getting the goddamn thing on board for one. The creature probably wasn't going to just hop into the hold if they asked politely. "Excuse me, bitch, would you step this way?" Well, one thing at a time. They had 3 days before they reached the Queen's planet, plenty of time to come up with something. Ripley had seen the layout of the Kurtz on screen back at Gateway, but maybe walking it would trigger some ideas. She went out into the chilled corridor. The Kurtz was a 2-function freighter, built not only for deep space, but also to enter a planet's gravity and land. It was shaped like an old-style bullet with fins, flat on the bottom with rudimentary wings, and was aerodynamic, more or less. She'd learned to fly in similar vessels, had gotten her ticket as a pilot in a ship not too different from this one. The upper level, where she now stood, was a series of rooms bisected by a main corridor that ran the length of the vessel. The command control room was forward and to her left. Across from her were a series of doors running down the hall, crew's quarters. So, let's take a little tour, shall we? She began to walk to the rear of the ship. Each room would have its own fresher, but the shower was communal to help regulate water supply. It stood in between the last cubicle and a small workout room. Beyond the gym and aft was the med center, which looked cold and sterile behind the clear plexiflex door. With any luck, they'd have no need for the facility. She reached the corridor's end, then turned back towards the front. To her left now was a large supply area, where the Marines had stored their equipment before hitting the sleep chambers. Past that, the mess. Ripley's stomach growled noisily at the thought of food. She stopped and looked in at the bolted-down tables and chairs. It would also serve as a conference room. She reluctantly walked on, deciding to wait and eat with the others. Adjacent to the eating area, she was back where she started, at the sleep chambers. All in all, a good enough ship. It was a bit larger than they really needed, but that wasn't a handicap. Besides, she reminded herself, thieves can't always be choosy. She shook her head. She was in trouble again, win or lose. She walked into the command area and past the 20-plus seats for crew takeoffs and landings, into the partitioned-off pilot's room. She stood for a moment and watched the console, its colored lights blinking or glowing in the dim chamber. No problems, of course. An alarm would have gone off. She stepped away from the board and to one of the ship's 5 stairwells to check out the lower deck. Ripley walked through the computer room and the APC bay without really looking. She felt her heart speed up a bit as she came to a stop in front of the double hatch on the cargo area. This was what she had wanted to see. The Queen's new home. She took a deep breath of the frigid air and stepped inside. It was a huge chamber, coated heavily with carb slip on every exposed surface except the work lights, Those were behind thick plates of clear steel. The acid-resistant grey coating of the carb slip made the chamber seem like what she imagined a giant intestine might look like from the inside. The coating was dry, but it had a greasy, almost slimy shine to it. There were 2 stairwells, leading to the sleep chambers and the mess respectively. Both sets of stairs ended at airtight and extra thick pressure doors. They would want to reinforce those before admitting their cargo, just to be sure. This place would safely hold the most noxious biochemical and radioactive wastes that men could produce. The engineers who designed the hold knew what the vile cargo would normally be: glass-crated solids or liquid in insulated barrels. But in a pinch, the doors could be sealed and the stuff pumped in through special piping so that the whole chamber could be turned into something like a giant toxic aquarium. The only sound in the room was her own breathing. She looked around the chamber and nodded slowly. A suitable place for the bitch queen. Let her dull her teeth and claws on the impervious carb slip. Let her sit like a bug in a jar, wondering what her fate would be. Fuck her. She had seen what she'd needed to, and the crew would be waking shortly. What she really needed was something to eat and a hot shower. She'd had no startling revelations, but perhaps one of the others had dreamed something up. She started back to the open stairs in the computer room. Maybe their closer proximity to the planet would offer more detailed dreams, ideas that they could use. It was just a thought, but then, their mission wasn't exactly based on solid facts so far, she thought, as the thick, treadplate steps rang hollowly under her boots. She grinned to herself as she moved through the slowly warming rooms, back towards the sleep chambers. Maybe the Queen would tell them how to trap her, if they asked politely. It wouldn't be much crazier than the rest of this trip. Wilks heard a few muttered groans from the other crew members as they climbed from their sleep chambers and stretched, put on clothes, and came back to life. He swiveled his head and tried to relieve the tightness deep between his shoulder blades. He'd had worse hangovers, but coming out of cold sleep always left him feeling disorientated and spacey. He'd dreamed, although he couldn't quite remember. "Good morning, Wilks." Billie. She walked over to stand by him, clenched and unclenched her fingers slowly. She looked pale. "You seen Ripley?" Part of his dream came back to him when he looked at her, more of a feeling than a picture, something sexual about Billie. He turned away from her slightly, uncomfortable. "No, I'm hoping she's making coffee though." He hoped he sounded more at ease than he felt. She nodded and walked towards the showers. Wilks tabbed his boots. Maybe he'd shower after breakfast. He yawned, then he followed several of the others down the corridor and into the mess. Ripley had indeed made coffee, in addition to putting out several trays of food packets and utensils. She sat at one of the long cafeteria tables, poking at her plate of steaming grey muck. Wilks poured a cup of coffee and grabbed a tray with a foil pouch labelled stir-fry. He sat down across from Ripley. "Hey, Ripley. You're up early." She nodded and watched him pour the contents of his activated packet onto his tray. It smelled like stir-fry, but was the same mottled Soy Pro grey as Ripley's. He grimaced. "You think they'd invest in some colouring for the food," she said. "You sleep okay?" "As well as could be expected. It's the getting out of bed that's a bitch." She nodded again and went back to eating. Respectful of her silence, Wilks turned and focused his attention to the other crew members who straggled in. McQuaid looked haggard and irritable, and Brewster started in on him. "Buddha, Cap, you look like shit." Brewster turned to Carvey. "You know, they say it's harder for the old ones to travel like this." McQuaid fixed Brewster with a cold stare. Yeah, well, it would have helped if I could have slept better. The sound of you virgins jacking off the whole time next to me kept me awake." Carvey snickered. Brewster tried to think of a comeback and came up short. He stalled, said, "Oh, gee, sorry about that, Cap, McQuaid cut him off. "Yeah, well, your mother's sorry too. At least that's what she told me when her mouth wasn't full in my quarters back on Gateway." Even Brewster laughed at this. Wilks smiled. The corporal was outmatched. Moto and Falk walked in together and picked up trays. "What's this?" said Falk. He pointed at a plate of crumbly tan substance. "Ah, the famed and much-loved military instant cornbread," said Moto, putting a piece on her tray. "You get used to it." "Like Brewster's mother," said Adcox. She smiled sweetly at Brewster. He stabbed a chunk of Soypro off his plate. "Oh, funny Adcox." Wilks was amused by the banter, but felt a pang of bitter nostalgia listening to it. Talking the talk was an integral part of military life. Some things hadn't changed. It had been a long time since he'd been in a group like this. He could almost hear his old friends talking, their voices superimposed over the Kurtz's crew. Jasper, Cassidy, Ellis, Quinn, Lewis. And as always, he felt the guilt. He was still alive, and they were dead. Billie walked in and pulled her damp hair into a ponytail as she considered the food choices. Wilks started to call her over when Adcox motioned for her to join her group. Billie waved at Wilks and Ripley as she sat down and started chatting with the other three. Wilks sipped his coffee and noticed that both of the male soldiers perked up considerably when Billie sat down, Brewster in particular. He grinned at her as Carvey recounted some story involving a trip to a bar on Gateway. Wilks was surprised by a sudden feeling of protectiveness towards Billie. Brewster wasn't her type, he was sure. She needed someone more mature. She had been through a lot. She needed somebody who could appreciate that. Like me, he thought uneasily. Ridiculous. They'd had opportunities before and decided to let them go by. What he felt for Billie was friendship, shared experiences. But that dream. Wilks looked away from Billie's group. Good that she had found some people her own age to hang around, finally. And maybe he was just developing some paternal instincts for her. Yeah, right. Billie found that she liked Dylan Brewster a lot. He was self-effacing in a mildly sarcastic way, had a bright smile, and was very amiable. He and Tom Carvey played off each other well. Their affection for each other was obvious, and in spite of herself, she hoped that it was only brotherly. She made herself think of Mitch as she listened to them talk, poking at an old wound that suddenly seemed important to feel. Yes, she still missed him, still hurt thinking of him. Ought not to be sitting here thinking about another man. Jesus, she was having breakfast with him, not screwing him. And yet each time Brewster turned his eyes her way, she felt a slight tingle in the pit of her stomach. Billie looked over at Wilks, who stared moodily into his coffee. What was she to him, exactly? Or he to her? She felt bonded to him, somehow, some kind of... Too much to think about. She felt tired already, worrying about relationships not an hour out of sleep. Troubled sleep at that. She had looked for Amy, running through her dreams and never finding her. Amy, she reminded herself, was the important thing. Ripley stood up and looked around the room. "Excuse me," she said. "Everyone's here, so I'd like to throw out a suggestion." The room quieted. Billie laid down her fork. "Thanks. I'm thinking that our dreams might tell us something new This close to the planet, she said. Maybe a more exact location, maybe numbers of aliens, something. I'd like you all to see if you can remember what your dreams were tonight, so tomorrow we can talk about it. One thing that all of your files showed is that you're highly creative and sensitive people. Spend some time thinking about it. I'm open to ideas, so if you think of anything, let me know. She sat down again and started talking quietly with Wilks. Think of anything like what? Said Carvey. Do you understand idea, Carv? It's kind of like a thought, but it's newer. Brewster smiled, pleased with himself. You wipe. I understand you're as sensitive as my skivvies. Billie tuned out the soldier's talk and thought about what Ripley had said. She dreaded the dreams, had tried all sorts of meds back on Gateway to avoid them. And now they were going to be stronger, more detailed. She shuddered slightly at the thought. Her earliest memories were of bad dreams. She'd never been able to keep them at bay for long either. Damn. Then again, she told herself as she looked around the pallid faces of the crew, there were worse things than dreams. They'd all found that out. Humanity as a whole knew it all too well. Brewster gave her a smile and she returned it, noting the slight flush in his cheeks. Well, at least she wasn't alone anymore. They were all in this together.